All right, today we are diving into one of the trickiest, but also one of the most powerful theories in international relations, post-structuralism. Now, stick with me, because this one promises to change not just what you see in world politics, but the very way you see it. So let's pull back that curtain and figure out what's really going on.
At the very heart of post structuralism is this really simple but kind of profound question. We tend to think about global politics as, raw power, armies, economies, that kind of thing. But what if the words we use are just as powerful? What if they don't just describe reality? What if they actually help create it?
Just look at this image from the withdrawal from Kabul. The way we label this event changes absolutely everything. Call it a humanitarian tragedy, and the answer is Eid, its resources. Call it a national security failure, and suddenly the response is investigations, policy changes, accountability. Or if you frame it as a civil war, like President Biden did, well, the response might just be to stay out of it. It's a perfect example of the core idea here. Language is never, ever neutral. It is packed with political power that tells us where to send our troops, our money, our entire foreign policy.
Okay, so to really get our heads around what makes post structuralism so different, we kind of need to understand the world it first stepped into. For decades, how we study global politics has really been dominated by a couple of major players.
And this slide really lays out the massive difference. So, on the left, you've got your mainstream theories, like realism and liberalism. They basically start with the state as a given. It's a finished building, right? And they try to find objective rules for how it behaves. They ask questions like, what causes war? But then, over on the right, post-structuralism asks a much deeper, much weirder question. It looks at the state and says, that's not a finished building. That's something we are always building. So it doesn't ask what causes war. It asks, how did we decide to call this thing a war in the first place? And who benefits from us all agreeing on that label? So what this all really boils down to is that post-structuralism isn't just giving us a new answer. It's telling us we've been asking the wrong questions all along. It forces us to dig into the history of things we just assume are simple, obvious facts.
Okay, so if you're going to go around challenging the foundations of, well, everything, you're going to need some pretty specific tools. Let's open up the analytical toolkit that post structuralists use to see how our world is actually put together.
The first, and honestly the most important tool in the box, is this idea of discourse. The best way to think about it is like the operating system on your phone or computer, right? You don't really see it, but it controls everything you can possibly do. It makes certain things easy and other things impossible. Well, a discourse does that for our social reality. It's a whole system of language that creates meaning and makes certain policies, like going to war, for instance, seem like the only natural, common sense thing to do. Now, this doesn't mean the physical world isn't real. Of course it is. A falling brick is definitely real, and it will hurt if it hits you. But post-structuralists would argue that whether we call that a tragic accident, an act of God, or a terrorist act depends entirely on the discursive framework we're using. The brick itself doesn't come with a label. We're the ones who give it one. So the next tool is deconstruction. And this is basically the process of taking apart these pairs of opposites that are all over our language. Think about it, civilized versus barbaric, or developed versus underdeveloped. Deconstruction shows us that these pairs are never neutral. One side is always seen as better, as superior, and that creates this hidden hierarchy. And that hierarchy isn't just about words. It's used to justify very real political actions and inequalities out in the world.
So, with these tools in hand, discourse and deconstruction, let's actually apply them. We're going to deconstruct the single most important concept in all of international relations, the state itself.
Post-structuralists argue the modern state is not some natural thing that's always existed. Its power, its very existence, comes from one very specific, ongoing performance, constantly drawing a sharp line between a safe, orderly inside, that's us, the nation, and a chaotic, dangerous, outside, that's the rest of the world. And this table here illustrates that move perfectly. On the left, you've got everything we associate with life inside the state: order, community, peace. And on the right, you have its exact opposite, which is how we define the international world: anarchy, difference, war. The key insight from post-structuralists is that these two sides need each other. We only really know what order feels like because we contrast it with anarchy. This constant comparison, this performance of difference, is what gives the state all its authority. So, if the state's very identity depends on this sharp inside/outside line, what does that mean for foreign policy? Well, most theories would tell you foreign policy is about protecting the identity and interests we already have. But post-structuralism has a much more radical idea.
And here is the really mind-bending part. Foreign policy doesn't just defend our identity, it actively creates it. Every single time a state points to a threat out there or defines another group as foreign, other, or dangerous, it is also at that very same moment telling its own people who we are. Our national identity is literally performed. It's brought into existence through the very act of foreign policy.
So, after all this, deconstructing language, the state, foreign policy, what's the big takeaway? Why does looking at the world through this admittedly weird lens actually matter? Okay, let's just recap the big ideas. First, language isn't passive, it's productive. It literally creates our reality. Second, the things we think of as fundamental, like the state, aren't facts of nature. They're political constructions. Third, foreign policy is really a performance of identity creation. And finally, and this is maybe the most important part, this totally reframes what power is. The ultimate power isn't just having more missiles or a bigger economy. It's the power to make your story about how the world works the only story, the one everybody else just accepts as common sense. And that leaves us with one final, and I think crucial question. If our political world is built out of language, out of the stories we tell about ourselves and about others, then the most important political question we can possibly ask is this: who gets to be the author? Who's holding the pen? Thanks for tuning in.